Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this new Yale career panel on the not-for-profit profession. My name is Trish Takemoto, and I'm going to be moderator for this session. Um, First, I'd like to say that we'll have the topics covered first, and that we'll leave 15 minutes at the end or so for you to ask questions. And if you could use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, that would make it easier for everyone so we can all see the questions. Um, just a little background on the Yale Career Panels. We've done this now for 13 years. We've had 63 events, which include not only these Yale Career Panels, but also fireside chats, which cover career issues. We've had a networking and advisory session, and also a town hall. So we continue these. We usually have about 2 events at least each semester. And we're absolutely, if you have any questions or comments, you can always go to our website, which is yalecareerpanels.com, and email us at yalecareerpanels@gmail.com. So I think that's all the information. So I'd like to welcome our panelists, which we're very privileged to have, Beatrice Chen, Grant Din, and Alice Hom. And first, to start off, I'd like to ask each of you to give us sort of a brief bio of your background in the nonprofit field. Beatrice, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Beatrice Chen, and I have pretty much been in nonprofits since graduating from Yale, starting out in the museum world. And I did a couple of years in museum education, and then returned to graduate school for education and urban planning, and then continued on at other museums. And then currently, I am the executive director at Immigrant Social Services, which is a community-based organization out of Manhattan's Lower East Side in Chinatown. So really having been both in nonprofit arts and culture, and then I also did a stint at Channel 13 and New York Public Library, and then now in the human services, social services nonprofit field. I'm just going to wrap it up there.
Okay, Grant, you want to go next?
Sure. I always tell people that at Yale, I really majored in ASA. So that was the bulk of my nonprofit work. After Yale, I worked in New York Chinatown for one summer, helping run a youth program at Basement Workshop, a group that was in Chinatown. And then I went out to Ohio to work at Oberlin College as the Asian American Counselor Coordinator. So I did a lot of the things that the Asian American Dean did at Yale, only with the grand salary of $1,000 a month. But it was a great job to work out there. And eventually, after 3 years, I returned to the Bay Area where I'm from. And I've worked at a variety of nonprofits. And the ones I worked at the longest were Asian Neighborhood Design, which did community development work in it did architecture for affordable housing, nonprofit housing development, direct services, and it had its own business in cabinet making. And then the job probably I enjoyed the most was at the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, where I got to work to help families learn more about their history, which many times included Angel Island work. And I mean, their families coming through Angel Island as immigrants and trying to help them learn about their past. And then since then, I've done consulting on various projects, including an exhibit at the Angel Island State Park on the wartime internment of Japanese Americans on the island. A little known part of the history. People generally hear about the immigration history, but it also has wartime internment history. And many volunteer projects as I kind of phase into semi-retirement now. So I do a lot of volunteer projects especially on historic preservation work, and I'm on a few boards, including the APIs for Historic Preservation, APIA HIP, it's called. Turn over to Alice.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Alice Y. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns. I'm calling in from Oakland, California, also known as Ohlone Land. I'm currently the executive director for Change Philanthropy. Change Philanthropy is a coalition of 10 national identity and practice-based philanthropic serving organizations. So I'm very lucky I get to work on race, gender, class, ability issues, and sexual orientation. And my way into this work has always been through an academic background. So I graduated from Yale, go Trumbull, in
Yay, Trumbull, yay.
1989. And from there, I always felt like what I didn't get from Yale, I had to get more of elsewhere, and I wanted to go on to graduate school. So what I didn't get at Yale was Asian American Studies, and I went on to get a master's degree in Asian American Studies, and from there went on to start a PhD program in history around queer studies, gender studies, ethnic studies. So I always worked on the intersection of race, gender, class, sexual orientation, and never wanted to be a professor, but always liked the work and the research. And always in my graduate programs, I needed to work. I needed to make money. So I had all these jobs, and I worked in uh, arts and culture field, and then I worked in student affairs. So I was a director of the Intercultural Community Center at Occidental College, and there was a job that came up. And I'm like a magpie. I'm attracted by shiny things elsewhere. So there was a shiny job where you get to work on race, gender, class, social justice issues, and that was at Occidental. So I went for that job, put my graduate program aside, and then there was another job in philanthropy. And so the field that I'm in now is in philanthropy. I've been in it since 2008. And in 2008, there was a job for a national gender and equity campaign at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in philanthropy. And I'm like, oh my God, what an amazing opportunity to work on race issues, gender issues. And I was asking them if they wanted to focus also on sexual orientation, and they said yes. So I went into the philanthropic field and I have been in it since then, and would love to talk more about, this crazy world that we're in for nonprofits.
Right. You've all had such diverse career paths. It's so interesting and so broad. Um, so I'd like to first ask you, well, where do you think the profession is heading? Is um, considering the recent elections, do you think that philanthropy is and working a nonprofit will be popular or more needed, or will it be more difficult?
It's all of that. And I would say,
So,
especially after this election, it's going to be even more needed, but it's going to be extremely difficult. I mean, I think we're going to be facing threats from our government. The Trump has already said, we want to get rid of the immigrants. We want to get rid of the Department of Education. We want to get rid of all these things. So the nonprofit sector has to step up. It has to fill that gap that is going to happen. So I think there was a question like, is it good or bad? It's like, it's going to be everything. It's just going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult. But the nonprofit sector has always stepped up when there have been gaps, because we know we can't rely on the public sector, the government, and we can't rely on the for-profit business corporate sector. So there has to be a very strong third sector, which is the nonprofit sector.
Beatrice, do you have, since you're in a community
Yeah, I
organization?
definitely agree. And I think nonprofit has always stepped up and stepped in, and to really fill that gap where, sort of the perceptions like the government should come in and help out. And so post-election, I think more than ever, nonprofits, especially those who who provide direct service, at Immigrant Social Services, we work a lot with low-income families whose main language is Chinese. So a lot of the forms, the benefits, and things they need support on. And I think this is really, you know, um, much more needed. But I think moving forward, it is also difficult, challenging, and then kind of thinking through how do we restructure the way processes and decisions are made. I see a lot of potential with the grassroots and mobilizing. And also I think definitely the philanthropy sector has also really rethought how funding should be distributed and allocated. And so this is really the time, and I think for all of the different moving parts to really work together versus being siloed as we tended to be before.
And Grant, I mean, a lot of your work has been done with consulting. Is this how do you see this as
Yeah,
your
as Beatrice mentions, the groups really have to work together now, and there may be efforts to drive us apart, and so we really have to be strong and working together. And it happened. I mean, groups had to deal with this, only maybe not as bad 8 years ago, because
Mhm.
um, at the time the there were not there was not consolidated power in all three branches of government um, as much. So it's going to be more challenging now, I think. But um, people stepped up. You look at 8 years ago, like Asian Law Caucus was already they launched a campaign immediately to say we can't let our rights um, be taken away for us and for the immigrant populations we serve. So for students out there, if you're looking for opportunities to get involved, this is as good a time as ever, and because the needs are going to be as great as ever.
Oh, so that leads into the next question. How do you actually get into the nonprofit? Do you start out volunteering in college, or you have to find a passion first and find your uh, nonprofit that way?
Yeah, I think there was another question that you had asked about how do you get it? I mean, related to that, but there's probably more avenues to enter in nonprofits than, let's say, the corporate world. For example, you can volunteer with an organization that you feel strongly about their work, and usually, if you have skills, they'll be interested in working with you. Of course, it does take time for the staff to manage volunteers. So just keep in mind you can't just show up anywhere, But if you have skills and you find people that you can work with, um, in general, I found they'll be interested in working with you, and that's often a good avenue to get in. And I was joking about my work with ASA as a student, but there are a lot of skills that you develop as an activist, a student activist, that can help you with a nonprofit, and that's something you can tell the nonprofit that I've never worked for a nonprofit, but I have this kind of skills, and I think I could really help you out. And as always with one, you can try to find out what way how you can help that organization. And there are a lot of Yaleys and a lot of nonprofits, So
Yes.
and non-Yaleys too who would be interested in talking to you. But Beatrice and Alice are out there now, so maybe you could give us more tips.
Yeah, Beatrice, do you have a training program, or how do you get volunteers and eventually, presumably, person?
Yeah, we get actually a lot of high school volunteers. They all New York City high schoolers, and then also those who are in National Honor Society. They have community service hours, so we get a lot of that to help fulfill. And then for community-based organizations, I think there's definitely more need in terms of, for example, like there's a food pantry, and we definitely need volunteers to
Mm,
distribute food, voter registration drives, and
mhm.
so definitely, like, if you are interested in um sort of more, I guess, task oriented, very specific, these are the ways to get involved. And most nonprofit organizations do post these volunteer opportunities. And I would say the other thing is, I think starting in undergrad, even through internships, and to Grant's point, I think Yale, looking back, really focused and encouraged extracurricular activities. And that really helped out, even just with like, I did a ton of like event planning and then community outreach. Remember, I worked at one of the journals and we had to go sell ads. And those were just like ended up being really useful skills to have, particularly in nonprofit, because so much of it is around organizing and then also programming and events and things like that. And then community outreach and marketing. And, you know, how do you communicate and message out in a way that your constituents will receive that? And I would say nonprofit, you know, I think with other industries as well, you do want people who have some sort of experience or have transferable skills. Um,
Mhm.
and and in nonprofit, you know, we need a lot of different skill sets. So yes, I wouldn't really just limit yourself. You know, if you're coming from the corporate, that it's too much of a stretch.
Wanted to also say that nonprofit is a range. Like there's so much, there's a spectrum to nonprofit work,
Right.
you know, grassroots to grass tops to, you know, even bigger organizations that might have, you know, hundreds or tens of millions in their coffers. And like a United Way is a nonprofit versus a grassroots organization. So you can have a range of um, kinds of jobs that you can get and in different kinds of institutions or organizations. So I just want to share that, as well as you know, how do you get into it? Like in the philanthropy field, I don't think people usually say, oh, maybe now, but in the past, it was like, oh, I really want to go in the philanthropy field. It's more like, oh, I know how to do fundraising. Oh, I know how to do a certain kind of, I have expertise in a specific area, and this foundation is looking for people who know housing, people who know health. So there's just different avenues to become a part of that. Also, there are associates. So you don't have to have the expertise, but you have to have, you know, usual skills, writing, communicating, now social media, now how to like even create a website. So there's just a number of different skills that you need to have to be in those kinds of roles. Project management, or I know how to organize, I like events, or if you're not, I think there's a sometimes nonprofit work is about people. So you should be good with people. But I also know folks who are like, oh, I like to do the IT part of the nonprofit, or I like to do X part, which is like behind the scenes and not front we're facing. So I do think that there's a lot of opportunity for people, depending on what you like. But one thing that I want, or I hope that people have, is there's a passion to really be a part of a community and help a community. And not just help a community, but that you see yourself trying to make a difference. And that to me is nonprofit work. You know, like I could have a grunt job and work, you know, I don't know, as an analyst or something, and make money, but that wouldn't fulfill me personally. So I feel very lucky that I have a position and a job that fulfills me personally, because that's how I see myself in this world. Like I am here to do something in this world. And not everybody feels that way, and that's okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So,
Oh,
oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Yeah, I totally agree with Alice. And if you have the passion for nonprofit work, that's really one way to get involved, and you'll find a way to be involved. For students, I'd encourage them to check out the Tina Ye Fellowship that you can apply to for the summer. You can take that anywhere in the country to work at a nonprofit, and you'll get funding for summer your time in the summer. If you work with a group that might not have money to pay you, this will help pay for your room, your housing and your expenses. So that's good. And then in New York, I think they call it the Mary Lee Shug Fellowship now, where there's a chance to work in a New York area community organization. And so those are great ways to get experience and do good things in the summer too.
Um, and Alice, you were talking about sometimes you have to know people, or you can be a computer person and just work on a website. Why don't you all talk about the characteristics of people who do really well in the nonprofit world, and then the characteristics of people who don't? Or is it sort of self-selection, I guess? I don't know.
Well, I always feel like, when you're a part of an organization, you want to be a part of a team. So you have to know how to communicate. You have to have some level of self-awareness of, yes, I can do the work on my own. And also I know when to ask people for help, or I know when to ask questions. Um, and I don't want to make it like, you have to be extroverted in order to be in the nonprofit world. You don't have to be. I think you just have to be self-aware of what kind of person you are, and what do you like doing, and how do you be a part of a cultural fit. And I think around a cultural fit, sometimes nonprofits are like family, and I don't actually like to use family in an organization, because it bleeds into so many things where it's not productive to, like, oh, I have this kind of issue and I'm gonna, battle it out in this kind of way, like a family. And for some people, family isn't a very good thing. So the framework in an organization isn't positive. But I do think there's something around self-awareness. Also, knowing that if you're like, has to be my way, any kind of place that you work is probably not going to be so good if you're tied into it has to be my way. I think when you're in an organization with other people, you have to realize, oh, how am I a part of the problem, or how am I a part of the solution? And how do you hold yourself to that? So those kinds of skills require self-awareness, understanding of other people, having some, being able to have social cues, understand sort of psychological stuff, like how to read people, how to read the room. I think those are all very helpful. And I think there always has to be a part for me is I would not ask somebody of my staff if I wasn't willing to do it myself, because I've been used to being in grassroots organizations where there's not a lot of money, not a lot of capacity. So if I have to take a trash, I'm taking out the trash. Like there's an event, it's like, oh, okay. We usually do this sometimes. We try to order a lot of food, but if like, oh, there's a lot of people here, maybe, we shouldn't eat the food, the staff, but we got to let our tend to have that, so there's just some awareness of that, as opposed to uh my way or the highway, or I'm going to be like extractive and take things, as opposed to like giving and recognizing there's some reciprocity in this kind of work. So you're not always giving to the detriment of yourself, but you're also receiving something. And one thing that's happening a lot in nonprofits is healing justice work, so that we do not burn ourselves out in this work, that we have to be here for the long haul. We have to be aware of, is this job killing me? Am I killing myself to be in this job or not? And I think sometimes words like killing, I'm getting sick because of this job, it happens. And I'm more mindful of those things lately, and especially in the past 8 years since the pandemic.
Right. Any other comments about the characteristics of people who do really well in philanthropy?
I think it is somewhat self-selected, just in terms of like people who are really looking for purpose, a calling. They do end up in the nonprofit, and that's really where I think the boundaries between burnout that you're seeing, and that's where, for staff who are like that, you have to really kind of set boundaries and make sure that they're not, because part of it, especially with the work that I have been doing, Asian American identity, it's like identity work. And sometimes it's just really emotional and personal as well. And so I think there's that. But I think in terms of characteristics, it also depends on the type of organization. I've worked at like small nonprofit, that's like just startup. You do everything, take out the trash, you're there, and in that way you learn a lot. Like you end up being a generalist and knowing how to do Photoshop and how to, fundraise, but then there are also really large nonprofit organizations that are very like departmental. If you need to run a marketing campaign, you just send it to marketing department. And that takes, and it really depends on what you're seeking and what kind of comfort level you are. Some people don't want to work in a startup environment. They want to have departments and things like that. And so that's something to also be aware of within nonprofit. There is really a diverse range, and to know like what to expect from the different cultures, and where you want to be within the nonprofit world.
Really true, because I've worked as a consultant for Asian Health Services, where there were 500 people on staff, and I think their budget's something like $50 million. And so, like Beatrice says, there's all these departments, and you might not know people who work in one of the 10 other buildings they've got. They have staff. So the management makes an effort to get people together. But you really get to know your own department a lot better, and ideally you'll find a good fit there. But it's a big enough group that it seems that for that group, sometimes people move to different departments where they fit in better, or they like the work more. But a group like that, and probably I'm guessing from my friends in philanthropy, have more benefits. They have a 401k that the employer might pay into, for example, that you might not get with a smaller group. So it's just a matter of, it's nice to have everything, but sometimes you won't if you're with a smaller organization that's just trying to get by. But oftentimes those groups are the most spirited, and the groups that later on you'll say, wow, that was really a great organization. We, work together. So it really is diverse, as both Alice and Beatrice have said. But generally, people work at these organizations because they believe in the mission, and they feel they can make a difference. So it's maybe a little different than I don't know. I haven't really been in the corporate world, so I don't know. Where money might be a bigger motivation.
Well, what can you tell us any like myths about working in nonprofit but versus the actual reality of working in nonprofits?
One myth that friends told me when they told their parents they work for a nonprofit, they said, "You don't get paid, do you?" It's like that's. I mean, I think now the sector is a little more established, but maybe in the community, you have to tell parents that you get paid. Things like that could be a myth. But another myth, sometimes, I mean, there's a writer named Vu Lei who has a monthly column, and he talks about people don't kind of a myth that people from business can just come in and help a nonprofit run better. That I think that's a myth, that these people from another sector can just come in and say, "Oh, you're not running very efficiently." But the people in the nonprofit have different expectations, different things that they're measured by. They're not measured by profitability. They're measured by how much impact you have. And so I guess that's kind of a myth.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in with Grant's idea about the indicators, because the outcomes from nonprofit are different from the corporate world. It's not about like how many units you sold, or what market share you have. How you have an impact on the people or the community, it's changed. How you see power is different. So and that might not happen within 1 year, or might not happen within one's lifetime. So it depends on what you mean by the outcome of something that you do in a nonprofit world as your mission. If it's to help bring more money to communities that have been under-resourced, you could try to figure out, how do you find that kind of information that more money is flowing to that community? Or it could be about, do folks now have housing, right? And for the totally houseless, do or not. So it's just different kinds of outcomes and indicators for what you want to achieve and what the impact is. So I think that's one big thing. No, I mean, a while ago there used to be a meme where it's like three photos. It's like what people think I do, what I really do, and uh, and it's like what I hope to do or something. And they had them for all these sectors. And I don't know. I think because in philanthropy, people might think it's just all about money and how great it is to give it out. But philanthropy is not just about giving money out. It's also about how do you because I don't work for foundations. I work for an organization that helps foundations do their work better. So I am considered working in a philanthropic serving organization. People like to maybe call it a philanthropic transforming organization, etc. But it's not like I'm the philanthropist giving money out. And we have to also think about how do people get this money in the first place? So in philanthropy, there's also another part where we're just like, oh, how did rich people get rich? Off of the backs of enslavement, off of the backs of people, right? Indigenous folks, etc. So it's not neutral philanthropy. It's not necessarily just good. So we're also reckoning with those things about like, how did you make your money? How did the Rockefellers make their money? How did the Ford make their money? How did new people with new wealth make their money? And reckon with like, maybe you made that money off of the backs of people. And maybe you made that money off of military weapons, smoking, etc. So I think there's other ways to think about good and bad in this nonprofit world.
Beatrice, you have anything to add to those comments?
I think we're affecting change, and so that sometimes it does take a long time. So I think that's really, you know, and it's systems change, and I think it's much more open to system change right now. So now is I think a really exciting time to be in the nonprofit where you know, we're questioning like the power system, how funds were allocated, where the funds were coming from. And there's a lot of conversation about that. And I think the other one I would say it kind of probably is kind of opposed to what Grant was saying. Nonprofit salary, it can be pretty decent. It's not like always like super low like everyone thinks. So that, that is something so don't just like dismiss it because of that. But yeah, I think that those were, yeah.
Okay. So you were talking earlier about burnout and your own health and keeping yourself healthy and committed. But if you do experience burnout, and what do people do if they decide they're leaving the nonprofit world? I mean, do they maybe transfer to another one, or do they leave entirely and maybe go into corporate or retire completely? um, what do people do when they leave the nonprofit world?
I don't think there's one size fits all. That I know they sometimes leave the philanthropy world because if they're women of color, Black women, if they're leaders with multiple identities, they are charged with trying to be successful when not given conditions to be successful. And they may go into consulting, they may go into writing, they may go into uh, taking a step away and maybe doing coaching work. So I think there's just a number of things that people go into. Or they might go back into teaching and they might get like, their expertise and they might like, oh, I'm going to be an adjunct professor and do this thing. Or they could go into another philanthropic institution. So there's a range. I think one has to think about like why did they leave in the first place? What was causing that kind of burnout? And if they're of a certain age and retire, then they go into consulting work because they want their hand in the pie a little bit and still be in the mix, but not necessarily in a leadership role or in another 9 to 5. So you could have your hours differently, especially if you're a consultant. I also know some people move into maybe not necessarily corporate, but there is corporate philanthropy. So they're in and a part of a different kind, or corporate social responsibility, CSR, so there's just different ways to be in that niche of philanthropy.
Mhm.
Yeah, a
So,
lot of people. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Alice.
so go ahead, Deborah.
Okay. I'm just saying a lot of people have gone into, like Alice's, from, let's say, from housing development, a nonprofit, into a corporation where they have a community development office that um, gives out the money to the nonprofits for housing development or community development. And so those are pretty large areas. And a lot of people believe, I know quite a few people who were heads of nonprofits who went on to philanthropy. And so they became like a senior program officer, because philanthropy values their education on the nonprofit side. Being in a nonprofit, we're always very jealous of philanthropy because they don't have to raise money. But it's they have many other challenges, as Alice mentioned, to for their work, because they can leverage their grants with other people's money to create a bigger impact. But yeah, so people do go to consulting with different from a 9 to 5 nonprofit to working as a consultant, or I've taken on a lot of smaller projects that I enjoy a lot, and they're, I guess as I'm older, I don't have the pressure to, or kids are all grown and things. I don't have to
Okay.
make the regular salary and things like that, and do things I really enjoy. But the burnout is important, because if you work for somewhere that the head people are expecting that you work a lot of hours, then that's something you should try to find out before you get there, if you can. Find out, about the balance that people have, that they can have a life, you're not working all the time. So ideally talk to other staff members who are there and say, oh, did you get to go home at a normal hour? And then when I started one job, I was really pleased to see that the executive director said, oh, I really try hard to make it home for dinner every night. And, sometimes I'll do work at home, but, it's important to be with my family. So that
Mhm.
sets a tone for everybody else in the organization. And so if you don't have that, you should try to find that out before you go. But yeah, people go into many different areas, as Alice mentioned, when they leave, and sometimes they'll still keep their fingers in the pie, I guess, by being involved in different ways. And I do want to encourage people, even if you don't work for a nonprofit, get involved in boards. Nonprofits really need good board members who are um, willing to fundraise too, willing to ask for money, because that's really important. It doesn't have to be on a huge level, but just use your contacts and help the organization. I can't tell you how many boards I've been on where people say, "Oh, I can't raise money." Yes, you can. People, that's the lifeblood of an organization, of a nonprofit, and if it's a smaller one, especially if the board members can take um, even a small role to raise, $10,000 or whatever. For many organizations, that's a huge amount of money. So I encourage people who don't go into nonprofits to still be involved as volunteers or board members.
Beatrice?
I think there's also a trend now of, especially mid-sized and small-sized nonprofit, where they don't have enough work, or they don't have the capacity to have an in-house CFO, director of finance, even like chief development officer. They would hire like fractional staff, and so you would have fractional CFOs, and they work, sort of part-time with your organization. They have other clients. So that's something I think some of the, and so they don't necessarily have to be nonprofit. And so that's a different avenue of exploring, nonprofit work and with different clients, for those who have those skill sets. Um, and then I think in terms of burnout, like now, I definitely I don't email staff during the weekends. That was not the case when I was, it was 10 years ago. Like we would be emailing all weekend. But now definitely like any email, I just bank until Monday, and make sure that the staff is not getting any emails, even, yeah, from me during the weekend. And that I felt like I had to be quite intentional about that. So, but still, yeah.
That's great of you, Beatrice. That's
I know
wonderful.
it's hard, but
Right.
but I'm like,
I did some consulting for this
yeah.
nonprofit where the director would stay up until 3 or 4 in the morning all the time, and
Oh,
and I don't know. If I were occasionally I would be awake like at 1 and I see it and I said, I'm not responding. I don't want him to think that I'm gonna be up for him. Sorry.
Alice, I was glad you brought up actually like if they go into a corporation and the corporation has a philanthropy arm, because I think we all forget that. We think of nonprofits being, oh, it's, you know, a nonprofit by itself, but there are now, I think, more corporations, or they're more visible, maybe I should say, that have a philanthropy arm and are now advertising it as, being part of being a good corporation in the corporate world. Um, and have you encountered that a lot with your work in philanthropy, directing internal corporate philanthropy arms?
Not particularly in my current role, but in my previous role at Northern California Grantmakers, we did have a corporate philanthropy conference to bring in the CSR and the
Okay, what is CSR? Just
Yeah.
social responsibility.
okay.
Yeah. And so for corporations that want to, do good, so they think about employee resource groups and having something that their employees want to support. So they offer volunteer opportunities or they offer like these affinity groups within your corporation. Um, so there's ways to uh, have their corporation have relationships to the community that they are living in or they're a part of, etc. I'll just say because here Levi Strauss has the Levi Strauss Foundation, the jeans, etc. And so they actually work in the countries where their clothing is made. So they do
Oh,
in like Vietnam or Malaysia, and so they try to help the workers who are there. And then they also do that here in domestically in the United States as well. So different corporations have like 3M or something in that make like post-it notes. So they do things wherever their warehouse factories are located. So those are one way, or that's a way for people to give back to their communities and to the actual locale that they're in.
Yeah,
good.
and my understanding is from those jobs, you're just, you go into the bank, for example, like Bank of America, and you start out there, and then almost all corporations have a corporate social responsibility position, and they tend to hire within or from other corporates in that role. And a lot of that is also has to do with the corporate volunteer programs,
Mhm.
and then also the employee resource groups. So yeah, so definitely if you're in corporate and are interested in corporate philanthropy in that sense, there are roles within the corporation, and I think they do tend to hire from within,
Mhm.
um, for that, and that's a very niche area in that straddles corporate and then philanthropy.
ERGs were really supportive of Asian health services when they had a program to combat the anti-Asian violence incidents that were happening in Oakland, Chinatown, where people would, their ERGs would get together and fund like the ambassadors program, which worked to protect people in Chinatowns. And so that's a way where people working in corporations can directly help the nonprofits and the community.
Okay, I think we have some questions here. Let's see. And chime in whoever would like to. It says, considering the growing need for nonprofit work in a Trump administration, do you see sector growing? Will there be increased donations and jobs, or will the political climate stifle that potential?
I think some groups will grow. During the first Trump administration, a number of groups really ramped up because people saw the need. Um, it, but then they'll also be under threat because who knows what the administration will do to go after either our sector or our people in general. So it will vary, but we all have to. There will be potential to grow, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with Grant. It's there's going to be a flurry of activity because it's necessary, and there will also be, um, uh, laws enacted and different policies where, if you even speak badly about the administration, they could come down and take away your tax exempt status. So I think there's already those kinds of threats. And there has been, Trump has said certain things, and I'm going to go after my enemies. And who knows how he's going to engage in that. Project 25 or 2025, laid out a blueprint for that to happen already. So there is going to be people who are fighting against that, and there'll be some retrenchment because these threats are actually very real.
Mm. And I guess nonprofits have to be on guard and are prepping now for any kind of backlash from the elected administration.
Yeah, and I also see new nonprofits being formed. During the pandemic, a lot of new organizations were formed. And then I think maybe the informal kind of mutual aid type of organization and collectives, um, and more coalitions, I think,
Mhm.
always kind of keeping in mind. It's sort of like there's a lot of opportunities, but then it's also you have to navigate that. And I definitely see like us, sort of leaning into the immigrants post-election. We're about to have a benefit dinner, and I definitely see people are like, yes, we want to support you. Whereas, you know, it, I think before the elections, everyone was really focused on elections. So
Mhm.
one of the things that we were talking about for this year is it's hard to fundraise for nonprofits in election year because most of the donations go towards elections. So that's also something that we consider year to year when you're thinking about nonprofit fundraising. And then with the election results, it's like, do you double down? But then you have to really make sure you navigate that. And then also within, particularly, I think for us in Chinese New York community, the diversity of it, and that's something that we're heading into just a very different landscape. Yeah, and how we think about it and how we talk about being immigrants and representing them.
We have the second question here is what's a good pathway to prepare for the nonprofit operation roles? This poster apparently has some experience that they'd like to leverage
I
into
think I think the key skills still is if you're coming from corporate or if you don't have nonprofit experience, it's critical thinking, it's problem solving, it's communication. And I think with nonprofit, for example, as a financial controller, you probably know the basics, and what you need to learn is how, for example, how government contracts work. How does government allocate that funding, and what are the compliance and regulations nonprofits have to face, and so I think those, hopefully, you're able to, I think it's easy to learn, just be curious and know where to find those resources. But I think the operation side, it's not that different in the sense that it's still systems thinking. It's building capacity, building infrastructure. And I would say I think the only thing with nonprofit is you're always kind of butting up against resources, the limitations or one or yeah, or restricted funding and things like that.
There are also a number of training programs and even master's degrees in like nonprofit management. For example, the University of San Francisco has MA in nonprofit management, and I know they're all around the country. If you really want to, specialize in nonprofits that way.
Oh, yeah, for nonprofit, is more schooling aside from getting, a BA or a BS, is that advantageous, or is that a requirement for some nonprofits?
That's
I
the
think
one you're going for. It doesn't have to be. But if you're going into a specific role where, and they would ask the job, the job description would
Yeah.
say reference with, academic degree in XY or something. But for the most part, I don't think you need to have advanced degrees. And I think we have known that lived experience and experience on the job is sometimes much better than like, having an academic degree.
yeah.
I'm just asking because of this. One of the questions from Laura, she's saying she has a very difficult uh, time finding a job in the nonprofit sector because apparently there are hundreds of applications. Is there a way of either standing out, or how could she make her job search a little easier? Is there anything advice you could give her?
I think one thing is if you know an organization that you like or that you're trying to apply to, see if you know anybody there or try to get, like an info interview with somebody or have somebody like, hey, do I know anybody who works at X org? And it's like, oh, I know somebody there. Can you introduce yourself to them and they can have a talk with you in that way? That's one way. I think what's hard is some jobs now are remote, like because there are no,
Oh,
there isn't a physical place for you to go, and they get a lot of applications everywhere now because it's remote. You don't have to be in a specific locale, so there are more people applying for jobs, and it's more competitive in that way. Um, the only way for me to think about that is, see if you know anybody at that role, try to like connect. Um, keep on trying. And sometimes if you're in an area, you might just want to talk to different people in that field and have informational interviews. And then through that, you get to know people. And then they'll know that you're looking for a job, and then they'll pass things on to you. So that's the kind of networking that one has to do.
yes,
Yeah, use your Yale alumni network.
yeah.
Like my first job out of college was a Yale alum hiring, and I think it's great. I think everyone who works in nonprofit from Yale is very open to having conversations and helping out. And then I would say the job applications, we're getting more, but they're not necessarily all quality. And so I wouldn't be so dejected over that. I don't know if you're seeing it on LinkedIn where they're like, oh, there's like 300 applicants. But yeah, it's so much easier, I think, for people to apply for jobs. Once we post on Indeed, it's like everywhere. And so yeah.
Alice, when you were at APIP, did you have people who would show up at some of your public events and kind of be schmoozing, trying to get into the sector? And are
Well,
they generally love, or what do you think?
Yeah, all the time. We would have events that are open to not just people who are in philanthropy already, but who are also part of nonprofits because they want to meet people who have access to funding. So it was always a mix. And then you just get to meet people there and, start up conversations, have some good food always, and start building up relationships with people.
So if people, I know you have um, branches around the country. So if they want to get into philanthropy, let's say New York, there would be events in New York they could go to and things like that, right?
Yeah, I don't work for APIP now, but APIP does have
Right.
chapters. And they're in the Midwest, Chicago, Northwest, Silicon Valley, Bay Area, LA, definitely New York, DC, and I think even Denver, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, so if people are interested in philanthropy, that's a group that works on behalf of Asian Americans who are in the field either as staff or board or volunteers, I guess.
And for any racial ethnic group, there's Native Americans philanthropy, Hispanics in philanthropy, APFI is for the Black community, APIP is for Asian Americans, there's Women's Funding Network, there's funders for LGBTQ issues. So different identity groups have their philanthropic affinity group as well. So it's not just for APIP or Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
Right.
Somebody has here a question. Do you think a CPN, certified nonprofit professional, I guess it's a certificate, is beneficial if you only have corporate experience? And I'm sometimes wary of those certificates because it's as if, you could take a 6-month course and you know something, but if you haven't had the very real world experience of being in a nonprofit or um, your own experience as a person, I tend not to look at those certificates, and especially DEI certificates. When I just see somebody's like, yeah, I have a certificate from Cornell University in DEI work, I'm a little wary of those kinds of things, but that's just my bias.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be good to have on your resume that you were actually volunteering already for a nonprofit.
Yeah. My wife had been in a nonprofit for a few years, and she did the USF program, which is designed for people who are working. So she had the work experience and not just the master's. So that I think helped a lot. And then there's a question about fiscal sponsorship and a barrier to sources of funding. Any views on this particular status for an arts group? Well, I guess it depends on the source. Whether or not, I mean, I've been with groups that just did not have their own nonprofit status, and they did have a fiscal sponsorship, and they were still able to get funds because of the work they do and their track record. And maybe they're in the process of getting a nonprofit status. But I don't know if Alice, in your I don't know if you fund arts types or any organization that doesn't have the nonprofit status. Do you look upon them any differently?
No, I don't, because my group right now is coalition and we're fiscally sponsored. So
Okay.
I'm not working in a typical 501c3 organization right now. It doesn't have to be, and I think more and more people and funders especially are open to fiscally sponsored programs and projects. It really just depends on what kind of relationship you have with that funder. And arts organizations in particular, there are not that many arts funders per se, but there is a group called Grant Makers in the Arts, and that might be an interesting place for you to kind of tap into to find out people who would fund arts organizations and in particular 501c3. And there are more groups. I feel like the nonprofit industrial complex, people are just sometimes like, there are too many nonprofits out there, and they route and they toe the line in a certain kind of way. They're not about justice. They're not about so I think there's sometimes people look sideways at the nonprofit industrial complex and see it specifically as that.
Well, any closing thoughts? We're at the time actually. Our hour is up. So I'd like to thank all of you, Beatrice, Grant, and Alice. It's been so informative and so fascinating to hear about this sector, which has so many different jobs available for everyone. you paying and non-paying. So I would encourage all of our, our audience to investigate. First look into yourself to see what you're like and what you would enjoy as working in a nonprofit, and then there are many different ones that you can find and volunteer for, and maybe eventually get a job at. So thank you all, and we'll hopefully see you at another panel soon.